The day they cast her out was October 27th, 1883. The air over the small, hardscrabble town of Providence held the brittle chill of a promise soon to be broken, the last vestiges of autumn clinging desperately to the cottonwoods that lined the frozen creek. Ilara stood before the Caldwell homestead, a place she had called home for the 2 years of her brief and now concluded marriage. She was 16 years old. Her husband, Thomas, lay in the town cemetery, claimed by the lung fever that had scoured the valley the previous winter. Jedediah Caldwell, her father-in-law and the town's self-appointed patriarch, stood on his porch, his frame silhouetted against the unforgiving light. His 2 sons, Marcus and Luke, stood on either side of him, their arms crossed, their faces set in the same stony resolution as their father's. They were men of Providence, which meant they were men of hard lines and harder certainties. Compassion was a currency they did not trade in, especially not for a widow who represented a mouth to feed with no corresponding benefit of labor or lineage. "The council has decided," Jedediah began, his voice as dry as the prairie dust. He did not look at her, but at some point on the horizon just over her shoulder. "Thomas is gone. Your place is no longer here. It is not fitting." Ilara said nothing. She clutched the small burlap sack that contained all of her worldly possessions: a change of clothes, a worn Bible from her mother, a small tin of her husband's personal effects, and a small leather pouch containing $4 silver and 37 cents. It was the sum total of her inheritance and her severance. She had not asked for it. It had been pressed into her hand by Thomas's mother, her face a mask of silent, helpless grief before she was ushered back inside by her husband. "We are not without Christian charity," Jedediah continued, the words sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Mr. Croft has offered you a position in his scullery, and the church has a cot in the poorhouse. You will not be left to the elements, but you will not remain under this roof. The books must be balanced." She finally met his gaze. Her own eyes, the color of a winter sky, were clear and steady. There was no plea in them, no hint of the terror that should have been gripping a girl in her position. There was only a quiet, unnerving stillness. "I will not be a servant, and I will not be a pauper," she stated, her voice soft but carrying with the clarity of a bell in the cold air. "I will make my own way." Luke, the younger son, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Make your own way? With what? You own nothing but the clothes on your back and that worthless patch of scrub your father left you." The land he spoke of was a 5-acre parcel on the northern edge of the settlement, a windswept rise of poor soil and prairie grass that her father, a dreamer who had died of exhaustion trying to tame it, had claimed years ago. It was legally hers, a fact recorded in the dusty ledger at the county seat, but it was considered a joke by the practical folk of Providence. It was good for nothing but rattlesnakes and regret. "That is my concern," Ilara replied, her focus unwavering from the old man. She gave a slight, formal nod. "I thank you for your hospitality these past years. I will trouble you no further." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not run. She did not look back. The residents of Providence, drawn to their windows by the quiet drama unfolding on the Caldwell porch, watched the small figure recede. They saw a destitute orphan, a tragic widow cast out to an uncertain fate. They saw a problem that would likely fall to the church to solve before the first heavy snow. Not one of them saw a survivor. Not one of them could have imagined the quiet, formidable wisdom that lay dormant behind those stoic eyes, a legacy far more valuable than the barren land to which she now walked. Ilara did not stop until she reached the crest of the small rise that marked the beginning of her property. From here, she could see the whole of Providence laid out below, a handful of sturdy but unimaginative wooden structures huddled together as if for warmth, thin plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys into the vast, indifferent sky. The town was a testament to a single idea of survival: the conquest of nature. Its inhabitants built their homes to stand against the prairie, to defy the wind and the cold with thick planks and costly iron stoves. They fought the land.
Alara's grandmother had taught her a different way. Her grandmother was a woman from the old country, a place of deep forests and deeper winters, where survival was not a matter of conquest, but of accommodation. She had spoken of a forgotten architecture, one that did not fight the elements, but instead formed a partnership with them. She spoke of homes burrowed into the earth, wrapped in the insulating blanket of the ground itself, using the planet's immense thermal mass to blunt the edge of the most brutal cold. She called them ground houses, earth shelters, winter hollows. To her, a house that stood fully exposed to the winter wind was an act of profound arrogance, an open invitation to disaster. As the wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, the idea solidified in Alara's mind. It arrived not as a desperate gamble, but as a logical, methodical solution. She could not afford lumber. She did not have the strength or the help to raise a traditional frame house. But she had the land. She had her own two hands. And she had the knowledge her grandmother had so carefully imparted. Stories and principles that the people of Providence, in their rush to build a new world, had long since discarded as old-world foolishness. She would not build upon the earth. She would build within it. And she would wrap it in the most potent and most overlooked insulator the prairie had to offer: hay. Her plan was simple in its concept, yet demanding in its execution. She would excavate a pit, line it with what materials she could find, erect a simple roof structure over it, and then bury the entire dwelling under a massive, carefully constructed haystack. The earth below would provide a constant, stable temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the tons of hay above would serve as an insulating barrier of unparalleled efficiency. It would be a house that breathed with the seasons, a shelter that did not resist the cold but simply ignored it. She walked the 5 acres, her eyes scanning not for a building site, but for resources. She found a slight depression on the leeward side of the rise, a place that would offer some small protection from the prevailing northwesterly winds. The soil was dense clay mixed with rock, difficult to work, but structurally sound. A half-mile walk brought her to the creek, where a thicket of cottonwoods grew, their wood soft but usable for a simple frame. Everything she needed was here. All that was required was the will to assemble it. The next morning, she walked back into Providence. Her destination was Croft's Mercantile, the same establishment where she had been offered a life of drudgery. Mr. Silas Croft, a man whose generosity always seemed to carry the weight of a future obligation, watched her enter with a pinched, expectant look. He likely assumed she was there to accept his offer. "I am not here for the scullery position, Mr. Croft," Alara said, her voice even. "I am here to purchase supplies." She laid her needs out on the counter: a sturdy spade head, a broad axe head, a small handsaw, 10 pounds of iron nails, a roll of tarred canvas. Croft tallied the cost, his eyebrows rising with each item. The total came to $3.63. Alara carefully counted out the coins from her leather pouch, leaving her with less than a single dollar to her name. She did not purchase a handle for the spade or the axe. She would fashion those herself from the cottonwood branches. "Building a shelter, are we?" Croft asked, a note of condescending curiosity in his voice. "A little lean-to on your father's land, perhaps?" "I am building a home," Alara replied simply. She gathered her purchases, bundling the heavy iron heads and the saw into the canvas. "A home?" Croft chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "My dear girl, it takes more than a few tools to build a proper home. It takes lumber, glass, a proper stove. It takes capital. A home is a serious investment. I am aware, she said, turning to leave. As she reached the door, she paused. I will also require a length of stovepipe. 6 feet should be sufficient. And I have a question about your hay. Croft's expression shifted from condescension to genuine bewilderment. My hay? I sell hay for livestock, not for whatever it is you're planning. I know, Alara said, but you had a stack out back. The one that was soaked in the last rain. The one you deemed unfit for sale. Is it still there? The spoiled stack? It's worthless. I was going to have it burned next week, he said, dismissing the subject. Do not burn it, Alara said. I will have a use for it. She left the store, leaving Silas Croft standing behind his counter, staring after her with a profound sense of confusion.
The girl was not behaving as expected. The destitute did not purchase tools. They begged for charity. The desperate did not speak of building homes. They accepted cots in the poorhouse. Her quiet confidence was unsettling, an aberration in the predictable social order of Providence. It was the first ripple of doubt in the town's placid certainty, a disturbance that would soon grow into a wave. The story of Alara's peculiar purchases spread through the town by midday, becoming the primary topic of gossip and speculation. By the afternoon of October 29th, the work had begun. Alara, having fashioned sturdy handles for her new tools, broke ground in the depression on the northern slope. The digging was brutal, unforgiving labor. The topsoil was thin, quickly giving way to a dense, rocky clay that fought the spade with every thrust. She worked from sunup to sundown, her movements economical and rhythmic, her focus absolute. She did not rush. She did not waste energy. Each shovelful of earth was lifted and placed with care, forming a neat pile that would later be used for the walls. It did not take long for her to receive visitors. On the third day of her excavation, a small delegation arrived, led by Jedediah Caldwell himself. With him were Mr. Croft and the town's spiritual guide, Reverend Michael Abernathy. They stood at the edge of the growing pit, their long shadows falling over her as she worked. Alara, the Reverend began, his voice laced with a practiced, paternal concern. What is the meaning of this activity? The town is concerned for your welfare. We had assumed you would choose a more sensible path. Alara paused, resting one hand on the handle of her spade. She looked up at the 3 men, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. I am building my home, Reverend. A home? Jedediah scoffed, gesturing at the shallow hole in the ground. This is a grave you're digging, girl. You cannot survive the winter in a burrow like some animal. Have you lost your senses entirely? My senses are quite intact, Mr. Caldwell, she replied, her tone respectful but firm. My grandmother taught me that the wisest animal is the one that knows how to use the earth for its warmth, not the one that stands shivering in the wind. Silas Croft stepped forward, adopting the air of a man explaining a complex financial matter to a simpleton. Let us be practical. A structure requires materials. You have purchased a few tools, nothing more. You cannot build walls from dirt and ambition. This is a folly, a dangerous folly. Come back to town. Accept my offer. There is no shame in honest work, no matter how humble. The shame, Alara said, turning her gaze on Croft, is in underestimating the value of what you discard. The earth you stand on, the spoiled hay you intend to burn, these are not worthless things. They are my materials. The 3 men exchanged glances. It was clear they were dealing not with desperation, but with a form of madness they could not comprehend. Her calm, logical rebuttals were more disturbing than tears or hysterics would have been. She was not asking for their help. She was implicitly rejecting their entire worldview,
the foundational beliefs upon which the town of Providence was built. "This is pride, child," Reverend Abernathy said, his tone shifting from concern to admonishment. "A sin of the highest order. You are defying the good counsel of your elders and the charity of your community. You are placing your trust in heathen notions and dirt. God provides for his flock through the community, not through holes in the ground. I urge you, abandon this path before it leads to your ruin." "God gave me this land," Alara countered quietly, "and he gave me the knowledge to use it. I do not believe he would consider that a sin. Now, if you will excuse me, gentlemen, I have a great deal of work to do, and the days are growing shorter." She turned her back on them and drove the spade into the hard earth once more. The sound was a clear, unambiguous dismissal. The delegation stood for a moment longer, baffled into silence by her utter refusal to be saved. They had come to dispense charity and wisdom, to reinforce their own positions as the town's benevolent leaders. They left with nothing but a shared sense of unease and indignation. Her project, from that day forward, was known throughout Providence as Ilara's Folly. It became a local spectacle, a cautionary tale in the making. The townspeople would watch from a distance, shaking their heads and predicting the grim and inevitable outcome. They were all in agreement. She would be dead or begging for rescue before the first snows of December. For the next 4 weeks, Ilara worked with a singular, relentless focus that bordered on the sublime. The town's mockery became a distant, irrelevant noise, like the cawing of crows. Her world shrank to the dimensions of her task, to the feel of the spade in her hands, the ache in her back, and the slow, satisfying transformation of the landscape. The pit deepened methodically, inch by grueling inch. When it reached a depth of 7 feet, she squared the corners and leveled the floor, her measurements precise. The final dimensions of the excavation were 14 feet wide by 18 feet long. Now began the second phase, the construction of the walls. She mixed the excavated clay with water hauled in buckets from the creek and tough, fibrous prairie grass she cut with a hand scythe. This mixture, a form of cob, was an ancient building material, heavy, dense, and possessed of a remarkable thermal mass. She built her walls directly on the earthen floor, raising them up from the base of the pit. She did not use forms. Instead, she laid the damp, heavy mixture in courses, packing it down with her hands and feet, shaping it into a solid, monolithic structure. The walls rose slowly, a few inches each day, needing time to dry and cure in the waning autumn sun. They rose to the level of the surrounding ground and then continued upward for another 3 feet, forming a solid, earth-toned bastion against the open prairie. While the cob walls cured, she turned her attention to the roof. This was the most significant challenge. She needed strong timbers for the ridgepole and rafters, but had no money for milled lumber. Her only resource was the stand of cottonwoods by the creek. Over the course of 3 days, she felled 6 of the straightest, strongest trees she could find, each about 8 inches in diameter. The work was exhausting. The crack and crash of each falling tree echoed in the silent landscape, a declaration of her progress. She trimmed the branches and then, using a simple system of levers and rollers, began the arduous process of hauling the logs the half-mile back to her building site. It was a feat of leverage and endurance, a testament to what a small body could accomplish when guided by an intelligent and unyielding will. She laid the largest log across the center of the structure, resting its ends on the tops of the earthen walls to serve as the ridgepole. The other logs she cut into sections and set them as rafters, running from the ridgepole down to the ground, extending several feet beyond the walls. This created a low-pitched A-frame that completely enclosed the submerged living space. The angle was shallow, designed not to shed snow in the conventional sense, but to hold it, to use its insulating properties as yet another layer of protection. She covered this rough frame with the roll of tarred canvas, nailing it down securely to create a waterproof membrane. Her home now had a skeleton. It was time to give it a skin. She approached Silas Croft again, this time with a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a whittling of her late husband's. She offered it in trade for the right to haul away the spoiled hay. Croft, seeing no value in the rotting stack and perhaps a sliver of pity in his heart, agreed. He even loaned her a wheelbarrow, an act of charity that cost him nothing, but which he would later recount as proof of his benevolent nature. For a week, Ilara moved hay. The stack was enormous, several tons of damp, compressed prairie grass. It smelled of mildew and decay, but to Ilara, it was the scent of survival. She worked tirelessly, piling the hay onto the roof of her structure. This was not a random act. It was a careful, methodical process of layering. She began by packing the densest, most compacted hay directly against the canvas, creating a thick, moisture-resistant barrier. On top of this, she piled looser hay, creating millions of tiny air pockets that would trap heat. She piled it higher and higher, covering the entire structure, the walls, the roof, everything. The mound grew into a small hill, a shaggy, organic dome rising from the prairie. At its peak, directly over the ridgepole, the insulation was 10 feet thick. It tapered down the sides, burying the earthen walls completely and feathering out onto the surrounding ground. She left only 2 openings. The first was a narrow, tunnel-like entrance on the south-facing side, which she framed with leftover wood and lined with more of the packed, damp hay. It was low to the ground, designed to minimize heat loss. The second was a small, carefully constructed aperture at the peak of the roof for the stovepipe. This was the most dangerous part of the design. A single spark could turn her sanctuary into an inferno. She addressed this risk with meticulous care, building a wide collar of flat stones and thick clay around the opening, ensuring no part of the metal flue would ever come into direct contact with the hay. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of damp earth and curing clay. She spent the final days before the first hard frost finishing the interior. From a nearby outcropping, she gathered flat stones for a floor, laying them carefully over the packed earth. In one corner, she built a small, incredibly efficient stove from scavenged bricks she'd found near the creek, mortaring them with more of her clay mixture. A flat piece of sheet metal, her last purchase, served as the cooktop. She installed the stovepipe, packing the final gap with a thick seal of fireproof clay. For a window, she stretched a piece of scraped deer hide she'd traded for, greasing it with tallow until it was translucent. It did not offer a view, but it admitted a soft, diffused light. Her bed was a raised platform of sod, covered with a mattress of the softest, driest hay. A simple table and a stool, carved from the stumps of the cottonwoods, completed the furnishings. On December 18th, 1876, she moved in. The total cost of her home, excluding the stovepipe and the traded goods, had been $3.63. From the outside, it was not a house at all. It was a large, shaggy haystack, an unremarkable feature in the vast, empty landscape. It was entirely invisible to the casual observer, blending seamlessly into the brown and gold tapestry of the winter prairie. The town of Providence, secure in their wooden houses, had all but forgotten about Ilara's folly. They assumed the girl had either given up and fled, or was already dead. They were wrong. She was waiting. And so was the winter. The first signs appeared on the morning of December 20th. A strange, pale light filtered through the high, thin clouds, casting no shadows. The air became unnaturally still, and the temperature, which had been hovering in the low 20s, began to plummet. A deep, resonant silence fell over the prairie, the kind of profound quiet that precedes immense violence. The old-timers in town felt it in their bones, a primal dread that their sturdy houses and confident pronouncements could not entirely dispel. They called it a breeder, a storm that gathered its strength in the vast, frozen emptiness of the north before unleashing it upon the plains. Inside her dwelling, Ilara felt the change as well. The air pressure dropped, a subtle weight in her ears. She went through her final preparations, not with panic, but with the calm diligence of a ship's captain preparing for a squall. She brought in the last of her firewood, a small but sufficient pile of seasoned cottonwood, and checked the seal on her door, a simple wooden plug insulated with rabbit fur. Her larder was stocked with dried meat, root vegetables stored in a small cellar dug into the floor, and sacks of flour and beans. She had everything she needed. The blizzard hit just after dusk. It did not arrive with a gentle dusting of snow, but as a furious horizontal assault. A wall of white descended upon Providence, erasing the world in an instant. The wind shrieked, a high, demonic keen that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the sky. The temperature plunged past 0, then 10 below, then 20. It was a storm of unprecedented ferocity, a true white hurricane born in the Arctic and sent south with a singular, malevolent purpose. In Providence, the initial confidence of the townspeople quickly curdled into anxiety, and then to fear. Their well-built homes, the pride of the settlement, proved to be shockingly vulnerable. The wind, moving at over 70 miles per hour, forced its way through every crack and seam, driving fine, granular snow into their living spaces. The heat from their large, inefficient iron stoves was sucked out almost as fast as it could be generated. They were burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate, yet the cold only deepened. The familiar sounds of their homes, the creak of wood, the rattle of a window, were drowned out by the terrifying, unceasing roar of the storm. But inside Ilara's haystack, there was only a profound and gentle peace. The 10-foot thick blanket of hay and snow absorbed the wind's fury, reducing its 70-mile-per-hour rage to a faint, distant whisper. The ground beneath her, warmed by the planet's core, radiated a steady, constant heat, keeping the ambient temperature of her home at a stable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even without a fire. When she did light a small fire in her stove, the space quickly warmed to a comfortable and easily maintained 65 degrees. The thermal mass of the earth and cob walls soaked up the heat and released it slowly, creating an environment of remarkable stability. She sat at her small table, reading her mother's Bible by the light of a single tallow candle, the outside world a distant, irrelevant rumor. She was not merely surviving the storm, she was utterly oblivious to its power. For 3 days, the blizzard raged without pause. The town of Providence became a collection of isolated, freezing prisons. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, burying houses to their eaves, rendering travel impossible and rescue a fantasy. The first to die was the youngest son of the blacksmith, a boy of 4, who succumbed to a fever in a house where the water froze in a bucket just feet from the stove. Panic took hold. People began burning their furniture, their books, the very floorboards of their homes, in a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching cold. On the 4th day, the wind slackened slightly, but the snow continued, and the temperature dropped even further, reaching an almost unbelievable 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. It was at this point that the conventional wisdom of Providence finally and catastrophically shattered. Jedediah Caldwell's large 2-story house, the symbol of his status and prosperity, was no better than a tomb of ice. His family huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air. Their wood was nearly gone. Their hope was gone entirely. It was Marcus, the elder son, who finally spoke the unspeakable. "The girl," he rasped through chattering teeth. Ilara, her burrow. Jedediah stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and haggard pride. The idea was absurd. It was an admission of utter failure, a repudiation of everything he believed. But as he looked at the frost creeping up the interior walls and felt the life-draining cold in his own bones, the hard shell of his certainty began to crack. Desperation was a more powerful force than pride. "It's a mad idea," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "It's the only idea we have left," Luke countered, his earlier mockery now a bitter memory. Slowly, painfully, a plan was formed. A small group would attempt the journey. Jedediah, his 2 sons, Silas Croft, whose store now had windows of solid ice, and Reverend Abernathy, whose prayers seemed to freeze in the air before they reached heaven. They wrapped themselves in layers of clothing until they could barely move, and tied ropes around their waists, connecting one to the other. They were not venturing into a storm. They were launching an expedition into a frozen, alien landscape that had once been their home. The journey was a nightmare. The distance was less than a mile, but it took them nearly 2 hours. The wind had returned, scouring their exposed skin with ice crystals. The snow was a treacherous, shifting sea of white, with drifts that were over 20 feet high. They stumbled and fell, hauling each other up, their movements sluggish, their minds fogged by the intense cold. They were guided only by a desperate memory of the location of Ilara's Folly. They were no longer the town elders, the men of substance and authority. They were just 5 freezing men, their lives dependent on the insane hope that the girl they had scorned had somehow managed to do the impossible. They almost missed it. The haystack was just another snowdrift, larger than the others, but otherwise indistinguishable. It was Luke who spotted it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the peak of the mound, dispersing instantly in the wind. It was a sign of life, a sign of fire, a sign of warmth. They clawed their way to the base of the mound, shouting her name, their voices thin and pathetic against the roar of the wind. They found the entrance tunnel, a dark hole in the side of the drift, and collapsed before it, too exhausted to do more. The plug door opened from within. A figure stood silhouetted against a soft, warm light. It was Ilara. She looked at the 5 huddled, frostbitten men, their faces rimed with ice, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. She saw her father-in-law, the man who had cast her out. She saw the merchant who had condescended to her, the reverend who had preached damnation upon her pride. She saw the young men who had laughed at her. She felt no triumph. She felt no anger. She felt only a great, somber stillness. Without a word, she stepped back and held the door open. A wave of warm, dry air, smelling faintly of wood smoke and baked bread, washed over them. It was the most miraculous sensation they had ever felt. They stumbled inside one by one, into the warmth, into the light, into the impossible sanctuary she had built from dirt, scrap, and ridicule. The interior was a revelation. The air was warm and still. A small fire glowed in the stone stove. A kettle was steaming gently. The space was small, but it was clean, orderly, and above all, it was alive. The 5 men, the leaders of Providence, stood dripping and shivering in the middle of the room, staring in stunned, reverent silence. Their world had been turned upside down. Everything they had believed about strength, security, and survival was proven utterly wrong. Their fine wooden houses were death traps. This primitive burrow in the earth was a haven of life. Ilara moved with quiet efficiency. She did not speak of their past cruelty or her present vindication. Her actions spoke for her. She helped them remove their frozen outer garments. She examined their hands and faces for severe frostbite. She ladled hot broth into tin cups and pressed them into their trembling hands. She moved with a grace and competence that was utterly confounding. She was not the mad girl, the foolish child. She was the sole proprietor of civilization in a world that had frozen to a standstill. Over the next day, guided by the almost imperceptible trail left by the first party and the impossible promise of smoke on the horizon, others arrived. Families with small, whimpering children, old couples, the strong and the weak. Ilara took them all in. Her small home, no more than 250 square feet, became an ark. She organized them, making space for the weakest near the fire, rationing her food and water, maintaining order with a quiet authority that no one dared to question. 15 souls, the remnants of the town's leadership and their families, found shelter in her haystack. They were the very people who had been the most certain of her demise. Not one of them had lost a family member. Not one had burned through their wood supply. And not one, in the warm, quiet dark of her life-saving home, would admit they had been wrong. But they knew. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. The sun rose into a sky of crystalline blue, illuminating a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white and profound silence. When the survivors emerged from Ilara's home, blinking in the brilliant light, they saw the true cost of the storm and the true cost of their own arrogance. The town of Providence was shattered. Several homes had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Others were buried so deep they were almost invisible. A terrible, final silence hung over the settlement. A grim accounting in the days that followed would reveal the final toll: 32 dead. 32 men, women, and children who had frozen to death in their sturdy, conventional, and fatally flawed homes. They had died clinging to a set of beliefs that the prairie had casually and brutally disproven. Ilara's folly was no longer a joke. The survivors, as they spread the story of their rescue, began to call it the Winter House, or the Providence Ark. It became a place of pilgrimage, a monument to a different kind of wisdom. Jedediah Caldwell, his pride scoured away by the ice, stood before her in the spring thaw and made a public apology in front of the entire surviving population. He offered her his home, his money, anything she desired as restitution. She refused it all. "I have a home," she said, and the simple truth of that statement silenced any further argument. She never left her small, earth-sheltered dwelling. It had been born of necessity and scorn, but it had become her sanctuary and her fortress. In the years that followed, others in the valley began to learn from her example. They built their own winter houses, dug into the hillsides, using the timeless principles of thermal mass and natural insulation. They learned, through the harshest of lessons, that survival was not about dominion, but about humility. It was about listening to the land, respecting the cold, and honoring the forgotten wisdom of the past. Ilara, the outcast girl, became a quiet legend, the reluctant sage of the prairie. She had not sought vindication, but it had been granted to her in the most absolute and undeniable of terms, written across the frozen landscape and etched into the sorrowful history of the town that had once so foolishly cast her out.